Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, 7 of the world's wealthiest democracies debating plans of action to block Chinese money from Russia. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen saying Chinese trade practices threaten economic ties. More on the reactions to Chinese state-backed subsidies. A warning from Washington's de facto embassy in Taiwan. The risk of broader conflict caused by China's provocative actions around Taiwan, Japan in the South China Sea. And in China, a MeToo activist has been sentenced to 5 years in prison. More on the verdict. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we turn to today's top story, we'd like to share an announcement. NTD's original documentary, Hollywood Takeover, China's Control in the Film Industry, is coming to the big screen in New York City this Saturday. It will screen at the Manhattan Film Festival on June 15th at 1 p.m. Take a look. Is it really just about money? Are there other parts at stake?
Chinese influence was playing into what we see in U.S. films.
China said, you can't have that in there. And Hollywood listened.
This is insane.
And we all know that their goal is global domination.
People have been brainwashed without knowing it.
That's this Saturday at 1 p.m. at the Manhattan Film Festival. Don't miss it. Click the link down below to get your tickets. A warning from President Biden Thursday. 7 of the world's wealthiest democracies are taking action on China. That's to stop Beijing from bolstering Russia's military capability.
At the G7, we discussed our shared concern about countries like China, for resource supplying Russia with materials they need for their war machine. And we agreed to taking collective action to push back against that activity.
The G7 is made up of the U.S., UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Together, they call the shots in global trade and the international financial system. Leaders from the member nations are gathered in Italy this week to talk about the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. And the U.S. is already getting to work. As Biden left for the G7 summit, the U.S. pushed a new round of sanctions. They target Chinese firms accused of bolstering Russia's military capabilities through trade. The new sanctions hit Chinese firms that sell semiconductors to Moscow. Also known as microchips, they are used in a wide range of modern weapons. The sanctions also give the U.S. the power to blacklist any bank worldwide that does business with sanctioned Russian financial institutions. The goal is to discourage banks, including in China, from bankrolling Russia's war on Ukraine. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says she's more concerned about smaller Chinese banks doing deals with Russia, though she left the door open for sanctioning the big ones if necessary. Yellen said, quote, "I think the large banks in China really value their correspondent banking relations. U.S. sanctions could cripple banks because they rely on the U.S. dollar for trade transactions. The currency is used for almost all global trade." Less than an hour after news of the sanctions broke out, the leading stock exchange in Russia suspended trading in dollars and euros. Worth noting, the new sanctions don't limit banks from doing deals related to Russia's energy exports. That's out of concern that choking off that part of the business could drive up inflation in the U.S. Also during the G7 summit, Ukraine's president said Chinese leader Xi Jinping made a promise to him.
I had phone conversation with a leader of China by phone. He said that he will not sell any weapon to Russia. That is the first. We'll see with you. We'll see. But he said to me, if he is a respectable person, he will not, because he gave me the word.
By the way, China is not supplying weapons, but the ability to produce those weapons and the technology available to do it. So it is, in fact, helping Russia.
Biden also announced the U.S. has mobilized more than $60 billion in a G7 project to counter China. 2 years ago, the forum agreed to pour $600 billion into a global infrastructure project geared at countering China's Belt and Road Initiative. Under that plan, Beijing offers billions of dollars in loans to less developed countries for infrastructure projects. But when countries fail to pay back the massive debt, The regime often takes control of their strategic assets, like ports, that could prove useful for military purposes. A final communique from the G7 member nations are hammering China over its support for Russia and harmful trade practices. They're also warning the communist regime over its aggression in the Indo-Pacific. NTD's Iris Tao has more on day 2 of the G7 summit in Italy.
It's day 2 of the G7 summit here in Italy, and leaders are turning their focus to China. A senior administration official told us that today President Biden and G7 leaders are looking into more actions to counter China's non-market practices and efforts to dominate strategic sectors which undermine U.S. workers and industries. That's been a focus of the Biden administration, which just a month ago announced massive tariffs hikes on Chinese steel, EVs, and semiconductors.
It's not competition, it's cheating. And we've seen damage here in America.
And here at G7, President Biden is seeking to build a united front against China's actions. In a final copy of the G7 communique obtained by NTD, G7 leaders will together express concerns over China's actions leading to global spillovers and harmful overcapacity. They will also hammer China on its militarization in the South China Sea, malicious cyber activity around the world, and the human rights situation in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. More importantly, G7 leaders will call out China's ongoing support for Russia's defense industrial base. President Biden naming China and supporting Russia on Thursday.
China is not supplying weapons, but the ability to produce those weapons and the technology available to do it. So it is, in fact, helping Russia.
And President Biden is scheduled to fly back to the U.S. later tonight, wrapping up his 3-day trip to Italy. And a final G7 communique will also be adopted later today. Reporting from Bari, Italy, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Risks to security and the economy. Speaking to Wall Street and business executives in New York Thursday, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen brought up how Chinese trade practices could interfere with economic cooperation.
China's overcapacity risks our supply chains being artificially overconcentrated, posing additional security and economic concerns. China also pursues a variety of unfair trade practices, from restrictive investment policies to economic coercion that further undermine fair competition. If China continues on this path, I fear that its policies may interfere significantly with our efforts to build a healthy economic relationship.
She stressed that the Biden administration is not looking to decouple from China, but does seek fairer trade practices and a more level playing field. The U.S. has unveiled tariff hikes on $18 billion worth of Chinese imports that will take effect this year. A new executive order from President Biden's office. Its goal is to safeguard supply chains, summed up in just 3 words: resilient, diverse, and secure. The document says the United States must be prepared no matter what kind of threats the country might face in the future, citing issues like pandemics, cyber attacks, extreme weather, and even geopolitical disputes. Beyond domestic needs, the White House also hopes to better aid its allies when they face challenges. Under the order, the first report reviewing U.S. supply chains is expected no later than December 31st. President Biden and his G7 allies agreed Thursday to deliver a $50 billion loan to Ukraine as it battles Russia. Earlier, we spoke with retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Robert Spalding about the latest loan. General Spalding also served as Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the White House National Security Council. General Spalding, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks. Great to be back.
Now, President Biden is in Italy at the G7 summit where they just signed a $50 billion deal to support Ukraine. What is your analysis of this deal?
It's the same as all the other fundings prior to it. There's no real goals or outcomes tied to it that I think is achievable in any time soon. I firmly suggest that we have armistice, ceasefire on the agenda for any, for future funding. Like, if we don't tie it to some kind of achievable outcome where there's a cessation of hostilities, this is just going to continue to be just like the Korean War, quite frankly.
This comes as China is pushing a alternative Ukraine peace plan. This is according to 10 diplomats. Now, one calling this is a subtle boycott of the global meeting that is set to take place this weekend in Switzerland. 90 states and organizations have registered. Russia is not invited, and because of that, China is saying they are not going to attend. Russia has called this entire thing futile. What do you make of China's plan here?
Well, you can change the word China for Soviet Union. Essentially, they're playing the same role that the Soviet Union played in the first Cold War, and Russia just happens to be one of their proxies to include North Korea and Iran, and a lot of other countries like Cuba, for example, where Russia is, just is making a port call, I think, really as we speak. So this is the second Cold War. That's how it's playing out.
General Spalding, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Washington's top diplomat in Taiwan has a message for the West. She said Friday that China's provocative actions around Taiwan, Japan, and in the South China Sea run the risk of an accident, one that could unintentionally spark a broader conflict.
The United States is profoundly devoted to a status quo in the Straits and in the region, the broader region, that is one of peace and stability. And that is why we have consistently urged the PRC to avoid coercive or provocative actions, both in the Taiwan Straits and in other areas like the South China Sea and off Japan, because provocative actions are almost by definition dangerous. They run the risk of a miscalculation or an accident that could spark a broader conflict, as you said.
Sandra Oudkirk serves as director of the American Institute in Taiwan. It functions as Washington's de facto embassy on the island. Despite the lack of formal ties with Taiwan, the United States is Taiwan's most important international supporter and arms supplier. In the past 4 years, China has stepped up military and political pressure against Taiwan. Just last month, Beijing held war games around the island following the inauguration of President Lai Ching-te, who won an election in January. China calls a separatist because he supports Taiwanese democracy. Microsoft's president says the company accepts responsibility for every cybersecurity flaw found in a U.S. government-backed report. This after Chinese regime-linked hackers breached the tech giant's network and accessed 60,000 federal government emails last year. He testified that Microsoft is facing aggressive foes in China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. He welcomed the opportunity to improve together with Congress. NTD's Jeremy Sandberg has takeaways from the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Microsoft President Brad Smith testified about the company's security practices and ties to China at a House Homeland Security panel on Thursday.
We have three objectives today: accountability, securing federal networks, and securing the broader internet ecosystem.
The hearing comes after a scathing government-backed report on the tech giant's cybersecurity flaws. That's after Chinese regime-linked hackers broke into Microsoft systems and accessed around 60,000 State Department emails last year. Microsoft's disclosures show Russian-linked cybercriminals spied on Microsoft's senior staff emails this year. A U.S. Cyber Safety Review Board report in April found Microsoft committed what it called a cascade of errors that allowed Chinese hackers to exploit basic well-known vulnerabilities using unsophisticated means.
In other words, this was avoidable.
Microsoft says it started acting on the report's recommendations last November, applying strategies from lessons learned.
We accept responsibility for each and every finding in the CSRB report.
Microsoft's president says the company is incorporating 18 concrete steps into future initiatives, on top of the report's 16 recommendations as part of its plan.
We now have the equivalent, full-time, of 34,000 engineers working on this project. This is the largest engineering project focused on cybersecurity in the history of digital technology.
Smith said Microsoft is focused on changing, strengthening, and building a world-class security culture. He says he's reminded employees no one ever died of humility.
Use the mistakes you make so you can learn from them and get better.
Smith said if Microsoft improves alone, it won't be enough. He welcomed the opportunity to learn and work together with Congress.
We're dealing with 4 formidable foes in China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and they're getting better. They're getting more aggressive. We should all expect them to work together. They're waging attacks at an extraordinary rate.
Microsoft is a key vendor to the U.S. government and national security agencies. Smith says Microsoft earns around 1.5% of its revenue from China and is working to reduce its engineering presence there. Jeremy Sandberg, NTD News.
Thank you, Mr.
China's foreign ministry appears to be lashing out Friday, saying it firmly opposes any country or organization that challenges its judicial authorities. That's after a Chinese court convicted 2 activists for what authorities called subverting state power. It's a charge the Chinese regime commonly uses to punish dissidents. An independent Chinese journalist named Sophia Huang Shixing was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Another activist surnamed Wang was sentenced to more than 3 years. The charges against the pair were based on gatherings they held for young Chinese people, where they would discuss social issues, including the MeToo movement. Wang also reported on issues like the 2019 pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. 2 diplomats who requested anonymity said consular representatives from the U.S., the UK, Germany, France, Denmark, and New Zealand attempted to attend the court proceedings. China rejected their entry. That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 3 years. If you'd like to support us, consider donating. Find us at donorbox.org/China-in-focus or subscribe to our partner platform Epic TV, where you can watch our full episodes. Just click the link down below. Here's what to look out for in our second half. Filipino activists are making their voices heard once more outside the Chinese consulate in their capital city, denouncing Beijing's self-described no trespassing rules in the South China Sea. Beijing is crafting its next move against EU tariffs, with hints from Chinese state media stirring speculation. European dairy and pork producers are bracing for potential impact. And just how tough should the European Union's new EV tariffs get on Beijing? We look at Germany's stance. More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.